Regarding this matter of PMO, I'd like to give a couple of thoughts that I think will be helpful to those of you who continue to struggle and fail in this matter of PMO. First of all, the Bible tells us that non-Christians are locked into bondage and slavery to sin. But when a person becomes a Christian, the Holy Spirit comes into that person's life, and legally speaking, the legal bondage to sin has been broken, and now the Christian is no longer in bondage and slavery to sin. But secondly, we learn quickly what the Bible tells us, and that is God has not delivered us from the presence of sin. We need no longer to become in bondage to sin, but certainly there's no way that we can escape the presence of sin. Actually, the presence of sin is something that will be in our lives for the rest of our lives until the day we die. But we are set free from bondage to sin, but we are not set free from the presence of sin. Now, regarding PMO, I undoubtedly have some men in the audience here who are listening to this video who have committed this sexual sin of PMO dozens and hundreds and perhaps even thousands of times, and now have found themselves back into bondage to this terrible sin of PMO. Well, I'm glad that God has not only told us that we are free from the bondage of sin, but if we find ourselves stuck in sin, or if we find ourselves in bondage to sin or struggling with sin, God has given us divine strategies on how to be set free, how to avoid those sins. And very importantly, if you find yourself in bondage to it or stuck to it, then God has given us divine strategies and how we can employ those strategies so that we can be free if we find ourselves struggling, failing, stuck, or perhaps even in addiction to this matter of PMO. So in this video and the next two videos, we're going to look at 3 divine strategies that God gives to us so that we can be set free from this horrible matter of PMO and other sins that we may find ourselves habituated to. Okay, so what is the first strategy that God gives to us that we are to employ by the Holy Spirit so that we can be set free from this matter of PMO? Well, the first strategy is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Paul's been writing in chapter 5, 6, and 7 is all about sex, but in chapter 6 he says this. He says in verse 18, flee from sexual immorality. Flee sexual immorality. Now we learned from previous videos that sexual immorality is a very broad term. It encompasses pedophilia, bestiality, homosexuality, adultery, premarital sex, and PMO. So let's take, for example, a young man who is in bed one morning. He wakes up and he's in the temptation and has these desires to do PMO. What does this verse tell that this man, this single man, laying in bed, waking up one morning, who's tempted, what is he to do when he's finding himself in bed tempted with desires to do PMO? Well, it says it very clearly, flee from PMO desires. So what does that mean? What would that look like in the life of this man? If he's in bed, how would he flee his bed in his bedroom? Well, he would get up, go out of the bedroom, and go down to the kitchen, or go into the living room, or go into the basement, or get dressed and go to Starbucks. But to flee means he's to get away from those temptations, those desires, and flee it by changing his location. Okay? Let's say that a husband is laying in bed one night and his wife is asleep next to him. He wakes up and he finds himself in the throes of temptations to do PMO and desires to do PMO. What does this verse say that the man should do, that husband should do in that situation? What does fleeing sexual immorality, fleeing PMO and its desires look like in that situation? Well, the husband should immediately get out of bed. He perhaps should go downstairs in the kitchen and get something to drink from the refrigerator. Perhaps he should go into the living room and open up his Bible and read and pray. Perhaps he, if it's the right time and the right hour, go down in the basement and work out on in the workout gym that he's got down there. The point is, he's got to get out of that location, and he's to leave and flee that location until those desires and those temptations to do PMO have passed. They're over and they're gone with, and then he can go back and get into bed and go back to sleep. Okay, that's what fleeing looks like. Changing one's location until the temptation and the desires are gone. There's another passage that tells us what to do similarly in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22, where Paul's writing to a young man who is a minister named Timothy, and he says this to Timothy in chapter 2, verse 22. Flee the evil desires of youth. Flee the evil desires of youth. Now, we could easily put PMO in the context of these evil desires of youth. So let's take this example of a young minister. He's in his study at the church, and for whatever reasons, he's now coming under temptation to do PMO. Those desires to do PMO are beginning to rise up. What does this passage say to this young man minister named Timothy? What's the minister to do in that situation? Well, it says here that he should flee the evil desires of youth. What would that look like in the life of Timothy, or a young minister who's about a mile down the road here working in his study at church, but he finds himself being tempted with desires to do PMO? What should he do? He should immediately get up and flee. He should leave his study. He should leave perhaps the church, or go down to the kitchen, or go to the sanctuary, or take a walk around the church, or go to the local Starbucks and get some coffee. But he should flee that location until that temptation and those desires to do PMO are gone and done and have vanished. And then he can come back to his office and continue his studies for the sermon coming up that week. If those temptations and desires come up again, well, then what should he do? He shouldn't stay there and try to battle his way through those things. He should change his location. He should flee that study until those temptations and desires have passed. Okay? Not very complicated, is it? It's rather simple. It's simple, but we're told that we are to do that. Now, you might have your own strategies. You might say, well, if I'm tempted, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, but you know what? The Holy Spirit has its strategies, and we have to employ his strategies if we expect to be blessed by him, then to be set free from the habit of PMO, getting stuck in the habit of PMO, or even having the addiction to doing PMO. If we want his blessing, we need to employ his strategies. And strategy number one is when we come under the temptations and the desires to do PMO, we are to flee those desires, that temptation, and flee that location and go to a different place. Okay? Now, by the way, in conclusion, it doesn't say walk. It says flee. It doesn't say casually stroll. It says flee. And fleeing means running. If you're fleeing from a neighbor who's chasing you with a shovel, who's wanting to hit you over the head and kill you with that shovel, you're not going to walk away from that guy. You're not going to stroll away from that dangerous situation. You're going to flee that situation at the top of your game, right? You're going to run as fast as you can. And that's what Paul and the Holy Spirit, through inspiration, is telling us through Paul to do when we find ourselves in the struggle with the temptation to do PMO and with the desires to do PMO. Okay? Strategy number one, if you want his blessing, then you're going to have to employ his methodology and his strategies. And strategy number one is when you're in the temptations to do PMO and the desires are there to do PMO, you're instructed by the Holy Spirit to flee that situation and flee that location. Okay? In our next video, we'll look at the second strategy that the Holy Spirit gives us. Look forward to seeing you then.